Welcome to the WizBooks podcast, your ultimate stop for exploring life-changing books and mastering English. Whether you're here to reshape your habits, gain new insights, or improve your language skills, we've got you covered. Dive in, learn, and get inspired. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into what makes a great teacher. And
Yep.
you've pointed us to Doug Lemov's Teach Like a Champion.
Yeah.
It seems like you're looking for some practical advice, not just some lofty theories.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that Lemov approaches this with a really concrete analogy.
Okay.
He says teaching is like sculpting. Michelangelo didn't just magically create David, he had to master tools like the chisel and mallet first. For teachers, those tools are specific techniques.
Okay, so we're talking about the nitty-gritty, the everyday moves teachers make that maybe we don't even notice as students.
Exactly. Lemov calls them micro techniques because they can seem small, even mundane. But he argues that just like a sculptor's precise chisel strokes, these techniques, when used consistently, have a huge impact on how students learn.
So give us a taste. What's one of these techniques that really stands out to you?
Well, one that often gets overlooked is the power of routine.
Okay.
Lemov gives the example of a teacher who times how quickly students pass out papers, pushing them to be faster each time.
Honestly, that sounds almost too basic.
Yeah.
How does that translate to better learning?
It's about maximizing every second of class time. Those little bits of wasted time, they add up. But it's more than that. It creates a culture of high expectations where even small things are done with precision and purpose.
I see. It's about setting a tone. So what other tools are in this teaching toolkit?
There are so many, but one that really resonates is no opt-out.
Okay.
Imagine a classroom where a student simply can't escape a question by saying, I don't know.
That does sound a bit intense.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that just make kids more anxious?
Actually, it removes the incentive to avoid trying. The teacher guides them towards the answer, maybe through hints or asking a peer. And then, crucially, the student who initially opted out has to repeat the correct answer, closing the loop.
So it's about participation and ensuring everyone ultimately grasps the concept.
Precisely. It reinforces the idea that everyone in the classroom is capable of learning and that struggling is a natural part of the process.
This makes me think of a teacher I had in high school who, but let's save that story for later. What other techniques are there in this Teach Like a Champion playbook?
Another important one is right.
Okay.
It's about being incredibly precise with what we accept as a correct answer.
Yeah.
Lemov says there's a huge difference between almost right and truly understanding something.
So no more close enough answers.
It's not about being harsh. It's about pushing students to achieve that 100% understanding. If a student is close but not quite there, the teacher encourages them to refine their answer, find the missing piece, or explain their thinking more clearly.
But how do you balance that with keeping students motivated?
Right.
Wouldn't it be discouraging to constantly feel like you're falling short?
That's where the bigger picture of Lemov's approach comes in. It's not just about individual techniques, but about the overall classroom culture. He talks a lot about positive framing.
Positive framing, what does that look like in a classroom?
It's about how you respond to mistakes and correct behavior. Instead of saying, don't do that, a teacher might say, here's what I need you to do. It's a subtle shift, but it makes a big difference.
So it's about setting clear expectations, but in a way that feels encouraging and supportive.
Exactly. And another part of that positive culture is what Lemov calls normalizing error.
Okay, now how do you normalize making mistakes? Wouldn't that just encourage kids to not even try?
It's about acknowledging that errors are inevitable, especially when learning something new. The key is to not dwell on the error, but instead to quickly shift to how to correct it, how to get back on track.
So it's about sending the message that it's okay to make mistakes as long as you're learning from them.
Right. And that ties into this idea of high expectations, but delivered in a way that feels motivating rather than demoralizing.
Okay.
And speaking of high expectations, that brings us to one of Lemov's key focus areas, planning.
Planning. I have to admit, I'm more of a go-with-the-flow kind of person. Why is planning so crucial in teaching?
Think of it this way. Effective planning creates the space for spontaneity and in-the-moment interactions with students. When a teacher is prepared, they're not scrambling to figure out what's next. They can really be present with their students.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what does effective planning actually look like? Is it about having super detailed lesson plans for every minute of class?
It's more about being strategic and intentional.
Okay.
One technique Lemov highlights is begin with the end.
Begin with the end. Isn't that backwards?
It means starting by defining your objective for the lesson. What specifically do you want students to know or be able to do by the end? Then you work backward from that goal to create a plan that will get them there.
So it's about having a clear destination in mind before you set out on the journey.
Exactly. That way, every activity, every question you ask is aligned with that ultimate goal.
Okay, I'm seeing how that could be powerful.
Yeah.
So you start with the end in mind, then what? How do you structure the actual lesson?
Lemov suggests a technique called shortest path.
Okay.
It's about choosing the most direct and efficient method to achieve your objective. Sometimes that means sticking with tried and true teaching methods, even if they're not the most flashy or innovative.
So practicality over novelty.
It's about focusing on what research shows works best for student learning, not just what's trendy.
Yeah.
And one example of a tried and true method is the IWU model of instruction.
You.
Yeah.
Break that down for me.
It's a way to gradually release responsibility from the teacher to the students.
Okay.
The I phase is direct instruction, where the teacher models the skill or concept. Then, in the we phase, the teacher and students practice together. Finally, in the U phase, students work independently, applying what they've learned.
That's a very structured way to build confidence and ensure students are ready for that independent work. But
Yeah.
does this approach sometimes risk being too teacher-centric? How do you ensure students are actively taking ownership of their learning?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And that's where those micro techniques we talked about earlier become so important. For example, during the we phase, a teacher might use cold call to ensure all students are participating, even if they haven't raised their hands. Or they might use wait time to give students a chance to formulate their thoughts before answering.
So these techniques work in concert with the broader lesson structure to create a more dynamic and engaging learning experience.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance between structure and flexibility, direct instruction, and student-centered learning. And that balance looks different in every classroom and with every group of students.
It sounds like effective teaching is about so much more than just delivering content. It's about creating a space where students feel challenged and supported, engaged, empowered.
It is. And a big part of that is creating a classroom environment that's not just productive, but also joyful.
Okay, so how do you bring the fun into a structured, technique-driven approach?
Lemov has some great ideas for that, too.
Okay.
One of my favorites is called the hook.
Okay.
It's about finding a way to grab students' attention right from the start of the lesson.
Okay, give me some examples.
Sure.
What kind of hooks are we talking about?
It could be a short story, a compelling image, even a personal anecdote, anything that sparks curiosity and makes the material feel relevant and interesting to students.
That makes me realize teaching is a lot like storytelling. You have to capture the audience's attention and keep them engaged.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
A good teacher, like a good storyteller, knows how to build suspense, create anticipation, and use a variety of techniques to keep the momentum going.
And what are some of those techniques? How do you keep that momentum going throughout the lesson?
One technique that I find really helpful is called name the steps. It's about breaking down complex tasks into smaller, more manageable steps.
I think we all need that in life, not just in the classroom.
Absolutely. It's especially helpful for students who might feel overwhelmed by a challenging task. By breaking it down into smaller steps, it becomes less daunting and more achievable.
This reminds me of, like, learning to code. They say the best way to tackle a big project is to break it down into smaller chunks.
Exactly. Same principle.
Yeah.
And when teachers clearly name the steps, it helps students track their progress and feel a sense of accomplishment as they move through each stage.
It's like giving them a roadmap for success. So, name the steps is about making those complex tasks feel less intimidating. What other techniques does Lemov suggest?
One that I use all the time is called board paper.
Okay.
It's simple but powerful. Students should have an exact replica in their notes of what the teacher writes on the board.
I could see how that, like, visual and kinesthetic connection would help students process and remember information better.
It helps with focus and engagement, too.
Yeah.
It's about that shared sense of purpose and understanding in the classroom.
Yeah.
Everyone is literally on the same page.
I love how these techniques create like a shared experience and a sense of collective learning.
It
It
does.
reinforces the idea that everyone is contributing to the learning process.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious about techniques for encouraging participation.
Okay.
How do you get kids actively involved in the lesson?
One that every teacher should have in their toolkit is called circulate. It simply means moving around the classroom as students are working.
I can imagine that helps teachers like keep an eye on everyone and provide individual support as needed.
It's more than just monitoring, though. When you circulate effectively, you're engaging with students, offering feedback, checking for understanding in a more personalized way.
So you're catching those aha moments and addressing misconceptions before they become ingrained.
Exactly. It's about being present and attentive in the classroom.
What other techniques encourage active participation?
Break it down is really effective. This is about what happens when a student makes a mistake.
So how do you handle those moments when a student is struggling?
Instead of just saying wrong and moving on, the teacher breaks down the problem into smaller, simpler pieces.
Okay.
This helps the student identify where they went wrong and how to get back on track.
It feels less demoralizing than just being told you're wrong, right? It gives students a chance to understand their mistakes and learn from them.
And it helps teachers tailor their instruction to individual needs.
Yeah.
By breaking things down, you can identify where a student needs more support.
It sounds like effective teaching is about being responsive to students in the moment,
Yeah,
constantly adjusting and adapting based on what's happening in the classroom.
precisely. And it's about creating a culture where mistakes are opportunities for growth, not failures.
Okay.
Now, to shift gears slightly,
Okay.
one technique that can really shift the dynamic in a classroom is called ratio.
Ratio. Okay, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
It's about the proportion of cognitive work that students are doing versus the teacher.
Oh.
The goal is to shift that ratio so that students are doing as much of the thinking, talking, and writing as possible.
That makes sense. So it's not just about the teacher lecturing while the students passively listen.
The goal is to create a more active and participatory learning experience.
But how do you actually shift that ratio in a classroom?
It's about asking strategic questions
Hmm.
that encourage students to explain their thinking, analyze information, and build on each other's ideas.
Yeah.
The teacher guides students towards discovering answers for themselves rather than just providing the answers.
I like that. The teacher as a guide, not
Okay.
just a dispenser of information.
And it's about creating a classroom where student voices are valued and respected.
Okay.
Another key technique for that is check for understanding.
We've all heard teachers ask, does everyone understand?
Yeah.
But how do you go beyond that and really gauge student comprehension?
It's about asking questions that require students to demonstrate their understanding, not just give a simple yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a quick written response, a thumbs up, thumbs down signal, or even a brief oral explanation.
That seems much more effective for identifying students who might be struggling silently.
And it helps teachers make adjustments to their instruction in the moment. If a lot of students are confused about a concept, the teacher can address it right away.
So it's about being a master observer, constantly paying attention to student cues and responding accordingly.
It's about creating a classroom where students feel comfortable asking questions and seeking clarification.
This has been so insightful. Now, one final area I'm curious about is critical thinking skills.
Okay.
How do you encourage that kind of deep thinking in students?
Lemov has a technique called take a stand that I find really effective.
Take a stand. Okay, tell me more.
The teacher presents a statement or question, and students literally take a physical stand based on whether they agree or disagree.
So it's about getting them to make a decision and commit to it.
It encourages them to think critically about the issue and justify their stance.
Yeah.
It often leads to some really insightful discussions.
It's a very active way to assess student understanding
It is.
and gets them more involved than just listening passively.
It helps students develop those skills of argumentation and persuasion, and it shows them that their opinions and perspectives are valued.
Like taking the temperature of the classroom in a really interactive way, what other techniques are there for encouraging these deeper levels of thinking?
One that I find helpful is cold call.
Cold call, like a telemarketer.
Not quite. It's about calling on students randomly, regardless of whether they have their hand raised.
Now, that sounds like it could be nerve-wracking for some students. How do you suggest handling it in a way that's not intimidating?
It's all about setting clear expectations and creating a culture of accountability.
Oh.
When students know that anyone could be called on at any time, they're more likely to stay engaged and prepared.
So it's about keeping everyone on their toes, so to speak. But wouldn't that discourage students from taking risks or sharing more tentative ideas?
That's where the overall classroom culture comes in again. If you've established a culture of respect and positive framing, cold call doesn't feel like a punishment, but rather an opportunity for everyone to participate. It's also important to use cold call strategically. You wouldn't use it for a complex question where students need a lot of time to formulate their thoughts.
Right.
It's more effective for quick checks for understanding or for revisiting previously covered material.
So it's a tool that, like all of these techniques, needs to be used thoughtfully and purposefully.
Exactly. And one more technique that's really powerful for fostering deeper thinking is wait time.
Wait time. That seems incredibly simple. How can a pause make a difference in student thinking?
That pause after you ask a question is crucial.
Uh-huh.
It gives students time to process the question, formulate their thoughts, and come up with more thoughtful answers.
So it's about resisting the urge to jump in and fill the silence.
It's about trusting that students have something valuable to say, even if it takes them a moment to gather their thoughts.
That's so true. We often underestimate how much processing time students need.
Yeah.
It's about shifting the focus from speed to depth, giving students space for those aha moments to occur.
Exactly. And another technique for encouraging deeper thinking is everybody writes.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
It's about giving students a chance to process their thoughts in writing before engaging in a discussion.
Hmm.
It could be a quick paragraph, a list of ideas, or even just a few key words.
I know when I'm trying to, explain something complex.
Right.
I often need to, jot down my thoughts first to organize them.
Yeah.
It's like giving students that same opportunity to process information before sharing it with the class.
Exactly. And it helps level the playing field for students who might be less confident participating orally.
Yeah.
It's a way to create a more inclusive and equitable learning experience.
So everybody writes ensures that everyone is engaged and actively thinking, not just waiting for their turn to speak.
It encourages reflection and deeper processing, and it gives teachers valuable insights into student understanding.
This has been so eye-opening. Now, there's one more topic I want to explore,
Yeah.
reading.
Okay.
It's such a fundamental skill, but it can be a struggle for many students. What does Lemov suggest for making reading more meaningful and engaging?
One of his most important techniques for reading is called control the game.
Control the game.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what does that mean in the context of reading?
It's about creating a structured and intentional reading experience where every aspect of the activity is carefully planned and executed.
So it's not just handing students a book and telling them to read.
It's about making sure that every minute of reading time is purposeful and productive.
Mm.
It involves carefully selecting the text, setting clear expectations, and using a variety of techniques to keep students engaged and accountable.
It sounds like teaching reading is about so much more than just decoding words. It's about fostering a love of reading, building comprehension skills, and creating a classroom culture where everyone feels successful.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that reading is a complex skill that requires explicit instruction and guided practice.
So what are some of the specific strategies that Lemov suggests?
One that's really effective is everybody reads.
Okay.
It's about ensuring that every student is actively engaged with the text, not just passively listening while one student reads aloud.
I'm intrigued. How do you accomplish that?
It could involve choral reading, partner reading, or even popcorn reading where students take turns reading aloud.
I can see how that would keep everyone on their toes and prevent them from zoning out.
It helps students develop fluency and expression, too.
Yeah.
And it creates a much more dynamic and interactive reading experience.
It sounds like so much of effective teaching is about finding creative ways to keep students engaged and accountable. What other techniques are there for making reading more meaningful?
One that I use all the time is track the text.
Okay.
It's as simple as having students follow along with their fingers as they read.
That sounds so basic, but I bet it's really helpful for developing those early reading skills.
It helps students stay focused, reinforces the connection between spoken and written language, and even helps them identify and correct their own errors.
Like training wheels for young readers.
Exactly. And it can be used at any age or reading level.
Okay.
Even experienced readers can benefit from the visual and kinesthetic reinforcement of tracking the text.
This is making me realize how much intentionality goes into teaching reading effectively. Before we wrap up this discussion on reading, I have to ask about vocabulary. It's such a crucial part of comprehension. What does Lemov suggest for helping students build their vocabulary?
One technique that's really effective is no vocabulary opt-out.
Okay.
It's based on the same principle as the no opt-out technique we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
If a student doesn't know a word, they're not allowed to just say, I don't know, and move on.
So how do you handle those moments when a student encounters an unfamiliar word?
The teacher might ask another student to define the word, provide context clues, or even break down the word into its root parts.
Hmm.
The key is to make vocabulary exploration a collaborative process, not a moment of individual defeat.
So it's about creating a classroom culture where vocabulary is something to be explored and mastered, not feared or avoided.
Exactly. It's about giving students the tools and strategies they need to become independent word learners.
You've given me so much to think about. I'm starting to see how all these different aspects of reading, decoding, comprehension, vocabulary, fluency, and engagement are interconnected.
They are.
It's about creating a holistic reading experience.
And it's about recognizing that every student is a reader, even if they haven't discovered that love of reading yet. It's our job as teachers to help them unlock that potential.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into Teach Like a Champion. I feel like I have a whole new toolkit for thinking about teaching and learning. But before we wrap up, Lemov talks a lot about building a strong classroom culture.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go beyond academics and cultivate those like character traits that are so essential for success in life?
That's such an important question, and it's something that I think about all the time. One of the most important things we can do as teachers is model those qualities ourselves.
So it's about leading by example.
Exactly. Students learn more from what we do than from what we say. If we want them to be respectful, responsible, and resilient, we need to embody those traits ourselves.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But how do you go beyond just modeling those qualities and actually teach them explicitly?
It's about creating opportunities for students to practice those skills in the classroom.
Okay.
It could be through group projects, role-playing activities, or even just class discussions about ethical dilemmas.
So it's about creating a space where students can experiment and make mistakes, knowing that they'll be supported and guided along the way.
Exactly. And it's about providing them with the language and the framework to talk about these important character traits.
You're right. Teaching characters about more than just lecturing about right and wrong.
It is.
It's about creating a classroom culture where those values are lived and breathed every day.
And it's about recognizing that character development is a journey, not a destination. It's something that we all continue to work on throughout our lives.
You've given me so much to think about today.
It's been my pleasure.
It's clear that Teach Like a Champion is about so much more than just techniques. It's about creating a holistic and nurturing learning environment where students can thrive academically, socially, and emotionally.
It's about approaching teaching with intention, passion, and a deep belief in the potential of every student.
Beautifully said. Now, before we move on to some more specific examples of Lomov's techniques, I'd love to hear from you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on this idea of micro-techniques in teaching? Have you ever noticed any subtle but powerful techniques that your own teachers used? Share your thoughts on our social media. We'd love to hear from you.
And one of the things that really struck me about Lemov's approach is how he highlights the power of technique in teaching.
Yeah, you're right. We often talk about good teachers having a gift, or a natural talent, but Lumov seems to be saying that great teaching is more like a craft that can be honed through practice and specific techniques.
Exactly. He uses the analogy of an artist. He says, who would look at a chisel, a mallet, and a file and imagine them producing Michelangelo's David?
That's a great point. We often focus on the end result, the masterpiece, but we kind of forget about all the skill and dedication that went into creating it.
And in teaching, those tools are the techniques that effective teachers use every day. Techniques to engage students, manage behavior, and deliver content in a way that really resonates.
So it's not just about passion or knowing your subject matter. It's about having a toolkit of techniques to bring your teaching to life.
Exactly. And just as a sculptor spends years practicing with their chisel and mallet, teachers need to put in the time and effort to master these techniques.
That makes me think about those teachers who just seem to have a knack for connecting with students and making learning fun. Do you think they're born with those skills, or can they be learned?
I think it's a bit of both. Some people might have a natural inclination towards certain teaching styles, but I firmly believe that anyone can become an effective teacher with the right training and practice.
That's encouraging to hear. So where do you start? If you're a teacher who wants to improve, what are some first steps?
Be open to learning new things. Don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone and try new techniques, even if they seem a little strange at first.
That's great advice for any profession, really. but especially in teaching, where it's so important to be open to new ideas.
And don't be afraid to ask for help. Observe experienced teachers, attend workshops, read books like Teach Like a Champion. There are so many resources out there.
It sounds like you're advocating for a culture of continuous learning within the teaching profession.
Absolutely. The best teachers are always learning and growing.
You've given us a lot to think about. Now I'm curious about the real-world impact of these techniques. Has Lemov seen evidence that they actually make a difference in student learning?
Absolutely. One of the things Lemov emphasizes is that these techniques have been particularly effective in helping students from disadvantaged backgrounds.
So they can help, like, close the achievement gap.
That's the goal. And he's seen some really promising results. He shares examples of schools that have implemented these techniques and seen significant improvements in student achievement, particularly in low-income communities.
That's really inspiring. It gives me hope that we can make a real difference in the lives of these students if we equip teachers with the right tools and strategies.
It really underscores the importance of investing in teacher training and professional development.
This makes me think about my own experiences as a student. I had some incredible teachers, but also some who, weren't as effective. I wonder if, looking back, I can identify some of these teach like a champion techniques that my best teachers used.
I bet you can. It's amazing how those small things can make such a big difference.
I remember one teacher who was a master at using humor to engage us. She could make even the most boring topics interesting.
That's a great example of the joy factor technique Lemov talks about. Creating a joyful and engaging classroom environment is so important for student learning.
It's not just about being funny, though. It's about creating a classroom where students feel comfortable taking risks, asking questions, and making mistakes.
Right, it's about fostering a love of learning.
And that's something that all teachers strive for, no matter what they teach.
Absolutely, and it's something we can all learn from, whether we're teachers, parents, or just lifelong learners ourselves.
You've given us so much to think about today. This deep dive into Teach Like a Champion has given me a whole new understanding of what it takes to be an effective teacher.
It's been my pleasure.
And for our listeners, I encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. Pick up a copy of Teach Like a Champion, observe teachers in action, and think about your own experiences. There's always more to learn about the art of teaching.
And remember, the best teachers are always learning and growing themselves. So stay curious.
Now, before we dive into some more specific examples of techniques from the book, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier: classroom management. Creating a positive and productive learning environment relies heavily on this.
It's such a crucial part of teaching, and it's something that every teacher faces.
Exactly. So, what are some of Lemov's most effective techniques for managing behavior and keeping students on track?
One of his key techniques is called 100%.
100%. What does that mean?
It means that when you give a direction, you expect 100% compliance, no exceptions.
That sounds a bit strict. How do you achieve that without creating a classroom that feels like a boot camp?
It's about setting clear expectations from the very beginning and being consistent, and using a variety of techniques to redirect behavior before it becomes a problem.
So it's about being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly. Lemov also talks about the importance of using a calm and assertive voice, even when you're correcting behavior.
It's like that saying, speak softly and carry a big stick.
Right. It's about projecting an air of authority without being harsh or punitive.
This makes me realize how much of effective classroom management is about tone and body language. It's not just what you say, but how you say it.
And it's also about building relationships with your students. When students feel respected and cared for, they're more likely to cooperate.
This reminds me of the teacher I had in elementary school. She had this amazing ability to command the attention of a room full of kids without ever raising her voice.
I bet she was using a lot of those nonverbal cues that Lemov talks about. Eye contact, posture, proximity.
Yes. And she had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when she was talking to you.
That's the power of a strong teacher presence.
It's something that can be learned and developed with practice and intention.
Absolutely.
This idea of 100% compliance is fascinating.
Yeah.
It's definitely something I'm going to be thinking about even outside of the classroom. Do you have any other classroom management techniques you'd like to share before we move on?
One that I find really useful is called do it again.
Do it again. So if a student doesn't do something correctly, you have them do it over.
Exactly. It sounds simple, but it's really effective. It reinforces expectations without being punitive.
It's about giving students a chance to practice and get it right, instead of just punishing them for getting it wrong.
And it helps students develop those important habits of precision and attention to detail.
That's beneficial in all areas of life, not just in school. Are there any other classroom management techniques you find helpful?
Sweat the details is another one I use all the time.
Sweat the details. Tell me more.
It's about paying attention to the small things that can make a big difference in the classroom environment.
Creating a sense of order and intentionality.
Exactly. It
Uh,
could be as simple as having a designated spot for homework, making sure desks are straight, or keeping the whiteboard clean.
It's like creating a visual representation of those high expectations.
And it sets the tone for a respectful and productive learning environment. When students see that you care about the details, they're more likely to care about their work too.
This makes me think about the importance of ritual and routine. Especially for young children, those routines can be very grounding.
Absolutely. And they don't have to be complicated. It's the consistency that matters.
This has been so insightful. Now, I'm curious to shift gears a bit. We talked a lot about structure and routine, but what about creativity? How do you encourage creative thinking and expression in a classroom that's so focused on technique and precision?
That's a great question. It's something that I'm always trying to balance. I think one of the keys is to create a classroom where students feel safe to take risks and experiment.
So, giving them permission to be creative, even if it means making mistakes.
Exactly. And providing them with opportunities to express themselves in different ways through writing, art, music, or even just class discussions.
So, creating a space where those different forms of expression are valued.
And recognizing that creativity isn't just about coming up with brand new ideas. It's also about finding new ways to connect with existing ideas and make them your own.
This makes me think about the importance of playfulness in learning. When we're playing, we're more open to trying new things and less afraid of failing.
Exactly. And there's a lot we can learn from children about the power of play.
That's a great point. So how can teachers incorporate that sense of playfulness into their classrooms?
Lemov actually has a technique for that called Vegas.
Vegas, like the city. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more.
It's about creating moments in the classroom that have that, like, game show energy. Maybe a quick quiz or review game, or even a fun way to introduce a new concept.
I see. It's about shaking things up a bit and injecting some excitement.
Right. It helps students tap into that competitive spirit, but in a way that's fun and supportive.
So it's about harnessing that energy and using it in a positive way.
It's also a great way to review material and reinforce learning.
You know, this makes me think about all the different ways we could be using, like game design in learning. It's not just for the classroom.
Absolutely. There's a whole field of study around gamification and how it can increase motivation and engagement.
We should do a whole episode on that sometime.
I'd love to.
Well, this has been a really insightful look at Teach Like a Champion. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of what it means to be a great teacher.
It's been my pleasure to share these ideas with you.
And for our listeners, I encourage you to explore these techniques and strategies. Don't be afraid to experiment and see what works best for you and your students.
Remember, the best teachers are always learning and growing too, so stay curious and keep playing.
I love that. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We talked about the power of technique in teaching, the importance of a positive classroom culture, and the impact these techniques can have on student learning. We even touched on our own experiences as learners and the teachers who made a difference for us. What are your final takeaways from Teach Like a Champion?
One of the biggest things I've learned from Lemov is that effective teaching isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions. It's about continually learning how students learn best and being willing to adapt.
That makes me think about check for understanding. We can't just assume students are getting it right. We have to be checking in, asking questions, and really observing them.
Exactly. And it's about creating a classroom where students feel safe to ask their own questions, make mistakes, and learn from each other.
It's about teaching critical thinking skills and habits of mind that will benefit them far beyond the classroom.
Absolutely. And believing that every student can learn and grow if we give them the right support.
This has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like I have so many new ideas and strategies to think about.
It's been a pleasure.
For our listeners, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Teach Like a Champion and exploring these techniques for yourselves. Even if you're not a teacher, there's so much to learn from Lemov about effective communication, building relationships, and creating a positive learning environment.
And never stop learning and growing yourselves.
Finally, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. Your journey to core knowledge and better English starts here. So keep learning, growing, and staying curious. See you next time.